So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is our Zen Peacemakers Circle, and many of you have been with us for other events. My name's Jeff. I'm the executive director of Zen Peacemakers, and I've been. I was talking with Christina earlier. Uh, I've been looking forward to this for since we scheduled it with Christina. Um, I, um, I got her book as soon as I could, and I shared with her. I read it cover to cover inside of 3 days, and absolutely loved it. I hope you all. We're not on a book selling tour here, but I hope you all do too. I couldn't recommend it more, and I just want to say a couple of things, and then I'm going to turn it over to Christina to kind of open with some statements, and we'll try to have a bit of a dialogue, perhaps, and but we want to have plenty of time for your questions as well. Uh, but I shared with Christina just how eminently readable her narrative is, her memoir. That was just it was like having a conversation and being personally told a story. Uh, I think it might have helped that we met once before, and I follow Christina on Substack. Another shameless plug. Follow Christina on Substack. Her sharings there are wonderful. But one of the things that I said just a few minutes ago was, you know, we're we don't lack for Zen books. there are there are plenty of them, but it is rare to come across one. And I cited Peter Matheson's Nine-Headed Dragon River. It's rare to come across one that is so transparent and personal and honest, and all of us who have taken up this practice, whether it's been
Peter Cunningham,
whether it's
FaceTime video.
sorry, I'm sorry. I apologize about that. Um, I should be able to block that. Christina's narrative is just so personal and accessible, and honest. And I was starting to say, so many of us who have practiced Zen for even a short time, and certainly those who have longer, have had struggles and have had times where where we had doubts, or where we perhaps even walked away, um, and you'll find this narrative just to be really uh, really engaging that way. And I don't want to make too much of this, but you come away really feeling like we've met one another. Um, it's that honest. It's just beautiful this way. Um, so I'm gonna pause there and mute myself and let Christina just give us a bit of an introduction. And I would normally do a bio, but Christina's bio is not quite as long as her book, but she's done she's done more in her life than you can imagine, and it's quite varied as well too. So I'm gonna hand it over, Christina, to you. And again, my sincere thanks, my friend. Thank you for being here, and we're looking forward to hearing you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thanks, Chloe. And thank you, everyone in Zen Peacemakers, for being here today and for the invitation to join you. Um, I know that when people hear about my story, and I know some of you have read my book and some of you may not have had the chance to yet, and so you'll be wanting to hear more about what it's about and some of the things that take place in it. And I know you'll have questions about the Zen training that I've done in particular, but I thought I would just take a step back. And, I write about it a little bit in the introduction, but I just wanted to share why I wrote this book, essentially. Because like Jeff said, there are a lot of Zen books out there. My intention wasn't really to write a Zen book at the outset. I am an ordained priest, but I am not a Roshi. I'm not a Zen master. And I felt quite reticent and hesitant to try to teach anyone anything. But I knew that there was something in my story that people found of interest, found edifying, found stimulating of their own growth. And so I said, there's this old adage in marketing and in writing, show don't tell. And so I said, okay, instead of telling people about Zen, and the value of training in this way, I'm just going to show them. Show them what my life has been like. So my book, 3 Years on the Mountain, 3 Years on the Great Mountain, a memoir of Zen and fearlessness. It starts with my ordination, but then I love this structure in storytelling and in movies. If anyone has seen Ratatouille or Goodfellas, you start at the peak and then you go rewind. How did we get here? So then I go about 15 years back almost to when I started meditating seriously. And I tell the story of sort of my whole journey in Buddhist meditation. I talk about very briefly how I was introduced to it as a teenager. When I was maybe 13 years old, I had my 9th grade biology teacher, M. Brown, in upstate Connecticut, gave me a copy of Shunryu Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. But I didn't really pick it up until I was in my 20s. And then I tell the story of essentially how my human rights work, working in Southeast Asia, advocating for democracy and human rights in Burma or Myanmar, led me to start meditating really seriously. It's kind of a very cloak and dagger dramatic story. Then I really spend most of the book, maybe like a full third of it, just describing my first 3 weeks here at Shozenji, which came about 12 years into doing Buddhist meditation. And I had done Vipassana, I had done insight. I had dabbled a little bit. I checked out a couple of Soto Zen centers here and there, and they hadn't really connected. But then I ended up here at Shozenji in January of 2018. And the reason that I write mostly in the book about the first 3 weeks is because that was the period of time in which I really kind of learned the ropes, the basics or the foundation of what the Zen training and what the life would be like here. And after I made the decision to stay long term, the following 3 years that I describe in my book are just really building on that same foundation. It was the same schedule every day. It was pretty much the same activities, doing zazen, meditation, chores, cooking, but also training in different martial and fine arts like kendo, the way of the sword, and chado, the way of tea. Those were just the things that I started in those first 3 weeks and then continued to do throughout the subsequent 3 years. And then the book, of course, ends with some reflection after my ordination. I think one of my favorite chapters that I like talking about is called "What Does a Zen Priest Do?" But the right way to hear that question is actually in the voice of the very silver-tongued old Southern pastor who somehow ended up being my Korean dad's like best friend in the rural town in Virginia where he now lives in retirement. And the pastor basically was over for lunch one day and said, "Now, what does a Zen priest do?" And then we found that what we do isn't so different after all. He was a little disappointed. But to get back to what I wanted to share with you about why I wrote this book. Again, it was less because I wanted to teach about Zen or talk about Buddhism. I think the crux was through my Zen training, I actually found a different way to approach life. Zen, I've heard described as a technology. It's definitely a religion and shouldn't be, sort of extracted or commodified to not be that. but it has a certain feeling to it where maybe faith and belief play a role, but more than anything, it's actually about what you do and how you live. And here in my Zen training at Chozenji, in this Rinzai Zen tradition that's sort of like Rinzai and samurai to the max, it's really this full-throated, vigorous approach to life. And it was one that I think I was hungry for my whole life. It was the same hunger that led me to be a human rights activist, that led me to, ever since I was young, always being labeled as a little too intense. But I was really looking for sort of like, where is that real fiber, the meat of a meaningful and engaged life? And I think I found in a lot of places, and in particular in a lot of spiritual traditions, a very beatific, maybe enlightened, but sometimes muted kind of approach to life. And it just never fit with who I was. The fullest expression that I found of myself was one ended up being in this Zen temple and martial arts dojo at the back of a valley in Hawaii, where we do sit quietly in silence, but we also yell and swing swords. And as I was telling Jeff before everyone joined, part of my training has also been boxing, Western style boxing, which people have a hard time wrapping their heads around as being related to Buddhism. But so just to cover some of the basics for folks who might feel a little lost and who haven't read my book. Chozenji is a Rinzai Zen temple. It was established in 1972 in Honolulu. We had two founders. One was from Japan, Omori Sogen, and he had reached a high level of recognition in the Rinzai Shu. He was in the Tenryuji line out of Kyoto, and he was also a pre-war kendo sensei. So he taught kendo. That was his occupation. And he also was an ordained priest and then became a Zen master. But he was never one of like the monastery. He was like not the abbot of a monastery. He had his own temple, but it actually was the very appropriately one of the temples of Yamakoteshu, who was an, I think, 18th century, very well-known warrior and samurai and military and political leader in Japan. His student was Tono Tenshin, who is actually Japanese-American, born and raised in Honolulu, and he was a school teacher. And every summer, since he had summers off, since he taught in the public school system, he would go to Japan and train in different martial arts. And between the ages of 22 and 32, he actually attained 6th and 7th degree black belts in 7 different martial arts in the Dai Nippon school. And just to put that into context, that's like, in that 10-year span, achieving 7 black belts at that high a level is kind of like the equivalent of doing 7 PhDs in 10 years. It's a bit it's quite superhuman, but he was literally just very plainly a genius in the martial arts. And then together, Omori Sogen and Tono Tenshin, they founded Chozenji in 1972, and then established it on the premises where we are in Kalihi Valley in 1976, with the purpose of bringing Shugyo, the deepest possible spiritual training or spiritual self-discipline, to the West. And they simply felt that it hadn't reached here yet. Our lineage is full of slightly shocking stories of Zen masters admonishing monks and their students for sitting like a dead monk in a cave, or some other, derogatory way of describing sort of Zen practice that has that soft and muted characteristic. And we come from this line of very iconoclastic, very sometimes abrasive, sometimes violent Zen teachers who really want to see a high level of vigor, a proactiveness, going for it with everything that you've got. And in that spirit of Shugyo and of bringing Shugyo to the West, Tono Tenshin's innovation was applying the martial arts, essentially like an accelerant to the traditional monastic training, things like Zazen, Okyo, and the manual labor that you see in the philosophy and study of sutras. And the way that that works just practically is, I don't know how many of you have done any sort of combat martial arts or even very intensive like partner dance or even intensive athletic activities like bicycling or marathon running. But there's a certain there's a certain moment where you take whatever inhibitions or fear you have and you just have to say, forget it. and then just decide, I don't know what's going to happen. This blister on my foot and I'm running, it might burst and it might bleed all over my sneaker, but I'm going to go for it. Now's the time. And imagine bringing that same energy to your Zazen, instead of the quiet abiding, which has a place and has moments. But at other key moments when it's like, I don't want to be doing this, or I'm facing this thing that I don't want to face, to just throw yourself into it, like you're bicycling up the ridge of a really, really tall mountain, or in a life or death battle, in a life or death encounter, doing martial arts or fighting with somebody else. That was the kind of vigor that they thought was required to make it shugyo, the deepest possible spiritual self-discipline. I think I'd be open to, there was one more thing that I wanted to add. One of my aims in writing this book as well and telling my story, well, I guess it's twofold. I wanted people to know that that this kind of training and this approach to life exists first and foremost. And I think in particular as a woman, I have a unique female voice telling people to do this. I mean, they're like, there's that guy, the former Navy SEAL, David Goggins, there's like Arnold Schwarzenegger, there are all these guys out there that are talking about the importance of doing hard things and how it's really good to be uncomfortable, but you very rarely hear it from women saying the same. And so I just wanted, first of all, to put it out there. I don't think I'm any less feminine for the fact that, I was just in a 90-minute boxing class last night, like trying to punch someone in the face and getting punched in the face. But so there's that. But there was also a cultural aspect that I wanted to share, a way of maybe broadening people's perspectives, not just in terms of sort of like that vigor and that feeling, but also just where some of this teaching can come from, the efficacy of it, and where maybe we find that feeling extant in other places already. And by that I mean in the cultures that evolved alongside Buddhism in Asia, and also in my context in Native Hawaiian or local Hawaiʻi culture as well. Part of the reason that I think training with the arts, training in a cultural context that's sort of like preserved, or that's still alive and dynamic, is really important, is because culture, like the culture I encountered here at Chosenji and in Hawaii, where whether it's through your values or just through philosophy, through food, through aesthetics, culture can be this container, can become the water that you swim in. And if it's a culture that actually is imbued and intertwined with the understanding of Buddhism, with a certain realization, then it's really conducive to one's training in Buddhism. It's, I think for that reason, that's why I tell so many stories in my book about Kendo, about Chado, how through those arts, through those lenses, and then through my day-to-day interactions with people, there were so many lessons, Buddhist lessons, that were not tangential, that didn't come sort of, that didn't require being tied together conceptually, but that just felt pretty direct because they had this historical and cultural context and align. And then I think, the other thread that I was trying to weave in from a culture and lifestyle standpoint was also just what it's like to be here in Hawaii, and representing Hawaii as the place where I now live and call home, and just the history of Hawaii. A lot of people actually don't know the history of Hawaii's illegal annexation at the end of the 19th century. They don't know the story of Queen Liliuokalani and how she essentially saved her people, and also just what a thinker and philosopher and leader and spiritual leader she was. There is one of the Native Hawaiian spiritual leaders, Pilahi Paki, that I mentioned very briefly in my book. She actually had something to say about the importance of Hawaii to the rest of the world, and how at some point the world would really need Hawaii, and specifically would need the spirit of aloha that Hawaii has. And so I wanted to bring that forward because maybe particularly in these moments of political division, of climate crisis, of wars boiling up in many different locations, of disease, it was important for people to know about this history of the aloha spirit. I have along those lines, I have an excerpt from my book that I'll just read quickly. It's from chapter 14, which is called Katonk. And I will define what Katonk means in the excerpt, in the reading. It's a little bit on the longer side, so bear with me. For context, I think I was talking about sensitivity. Sensitivity being essentially a heightening of the senses, but also in a social context, meaning a sensitivity to social dynamics and sort of like who's around and what's happening in a room. Rather than being treated as a principle unique to Zen or Japanese culture, I repeatedly heard sensitivity described as an innately human ability that is both primitive and transcendent. It is also universal. This universality was underscored by the fact that sensitivity was not only taught here through a Japanese lens, but a Native Hawaiian one as well. Before she was overthrown by American plantation owners in 1893, Hawaii's last ruling monarch, Queen Liliuokalani, famously said, "To gain the kingdom of heaven is to hear what is not said, to see what cannot be seen, and to know the unknowable. This is aloha." The first time I heard this definition was during my first few days at the dojo, and I had heard it several times more in the following weeks. A poster bearing Native Hawaiian spiritual leader Pilahi Paki's definition of the aloha spirit also hung prominently in the kitchen. It was one of many that had been printed in a public awareness campaign spearheaded by Tonoi Rotaishi. Later on, I would meet many local people who were able to recite from memory each of the words in Olelo Hawaii that made up Auntie Pilahi's rendering. A stands for akahai, meaning kindness to be expressed with tenderness. L stands for lokahi, meaning unity to be expressed with harmony. O stands for olu olu, meaning agreeable to be expressed with pleasantness. H stands for ha'a ha'a, meaning humility to be expressed with modesty. A stands for ahonui, meaning patience to be expressed with perseverance. Cultivating my ability to hear what was unspoken and see what could not be seen would make me more sensitive to the existing flow of any situation. Then I could see the ways in which I might be interrupting that flow, as well as how to be in accord with it. I had to cultivate humility, casting away my ego, individual desires, and small self to just match my surroundings, not sticking out and not seeking attention or praise. And I had to be patient and persevere, knowing that all this self-cultivation would take years, if not an entire lifetime. Perhaps my greatest obstacle to cultivating my sensitivity, I learned, came from the fact that I had grown up, for the most part, on the mainland. Not long after my arrival, Chosenji's archbishop, who was also Korean, sat me down to learn about my background and what I thought of Zen training. We talked about many things, including how he had come to train at the dojo decades before and what it was like in the old days. At one point, the conversation touched on the differences between how we had grown up. Me as a Korean American on the mainland, and him as a Korean American in Hawaii. "Do you know the word katonk?" he asked enthusiastically. A mischievous smile spread across his face, reminding me of Sayama Roshi, my teacher. I replied that no, I did not. "Katonk is what we call you, Asian Americans from the mainland. You guys have a chip on your shoulder." He might have seen the now familiar look of shell shock that came over me whenever I was being scolded, because he quickly qualified, "It's not your fault. It's because you grew up as a minority. It's kind of traumatic." I had never met an Asian American person who had not grown up with the indelible traumas of being a minority. If not an overtly oppressed and discriminated against minority, then at least feeling at some point like they had been hoodwinked into assimilating, giving up their culture and sense of wholeness, only to realize that they'd been sold a bill of goods. I had never imagined that a person of Asian descent could grow up in America without a chip on her shoulder. The clarity and insight of the Archbishop's perspective, as someone so similar and yet so different from me, felt particularly piercing because it seemed purely due to the fact that he'd been lucky enough to be born in Hawaii. It makes you numb, kind of, stupid. The word katonk comes from the sound that it makes when you knock on your head, he said, rapping his knuckles on his own skull, because it's empty. I searched for the proper response and found none. Was I being insulted? Throughout our meeting, he'd been so sympathetic and nice. He'd even praised me, saying that because of my global experience, I'd bring a broader perspective to the dojo. But still, I could not help but wonder if, by offering up an explanation of the word katonk, he was bringing home my shortcomings, delivering another of the innumerable and sometimes veiled scoldings that felt in such high supply at the dojo. Perhaps he could already sense something, I thought, some deeper flaw in me I couldn't yet see. Or maybe I had betrayed my lack of sensitivity over the course of our conversation. Or maybe I really was just a little stupid. "Stupid," I said to myself, and at this thought, I found myself magically broken out of my spell of self-doubt. I even laughed a little bit. What a luxury it was, I realized, to be in a place where I could be stupid. I could falter and be out of sync here and screw things up, and yet there weren't any real consequences. How fun, I thought, to be able to recognize and fully engage with the grating parts of myself that people had never had the courage to tell me about, but that I had always suspected they felt. Moreover, what a privilege it was to know that everyone here was approaching in their own limitations, in their own ways, which meant I was, as far as I was concerned, in the best of company.
I'm happy you read that chapter, Christina. That one really I enjoyed quite a lot as well, and I really felt you when you asked yourself, "Am I being insulted?" That was another moment of transparency that was just lovely. Yeah, that's very nice, very nice. And it's liberating, isn't it? When we realize we don't need to be the smartest one in the room, can let that go.
Yeah, I'll admit that was a big part, and maybe continues to be a big part of my training. And one of the things that I work on, we so often think in Zen or in Buddhism that what we're supposed to be contemplating and working on are these like I don't know, really esoteric and very romantic sort of like realizations and awakenings. But sometimes it actually is rooted in, the realization is rooted in something as simple as like, can I not try to direct the conversation to where I want it to go? Can I
Yes.
not project my assumptions on the situation right now? I I often share with people, or I don't usually share it out of context, but it comes to mind now, and I'll share it with y'all. We have a beginners class at Chosenji. Maybe like unlike a lot of the Zen centers on the continent, we don't like subsist off of retreats and people coming in and going. But I guess that maybe that's also true of Zen centers on the continent. But maybe like 95% of Chosenji's members are local. Like they live on Oahu, they have jobs, they have families, and then they just come up a couple days a week to sit zazen or to do work on the grounds and to train in a martial art or a fine art or both. And the way that people sort of like get started is we have a beginner's class, and basically we use that class to help people learn to sit for 45 minutes without moving, and then to learn some of the forms. But there is also an aspect of kind of screening people socially for like whether they're going to be an additive or detrimental sort of to the community. Um, my our head priest here really likes saying this because it has a certain shock value. He says
Well,
that I think he uses a curse word when he says it. It's like assholes generally don't make it very long in Zen training. And the reason that he says that is because you might start out that way. Well, first of all, you might quit. If you feel that it's not for you, you don't want to change who you are. But if you do decide to change, then you don't stay that person forever. And so a really good example of that is in this beginner's class. People ask me, how long does it take to get through? And when I used to teach it, I would say it would really vary. And there would be some people who they can figure out how to sit 45 minutes without moving. It only takes like once or twice to come to the class. And so I graduate them, and then they can sit in the big dojo with everyone else and then start taking a martial art or a fine art class. But there have been people that I've kept in that class for 3, 4 months, coming once or twice a week. And it was just because there was a certain there was an attitude that needed to adjust before it was, before I felt okay, sort of like letting them train with the general population because of all the friction that would be caused.
Now, what are you guys doing?
And so for me, I think that was, that continues to be part of my experience and my training is not like these esoteric concepts that I need to understand or have a realization about. It's something as fundamental and as simple as, what are the aspects of my personality that I want to change, and just finding out how to sort of like, for lack of a word, get along.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I was listening as you described martial arts and then some other physical activities where and I've never done martial arts, but I was a distance road cyclist and trail runner and so forth, and you reach those places where where you just have to push through, and I was reminded of even without an exposure to any of those things, when we first begin koan practice, Master Mumon's instructions for the first koan in the Mumonkan really reads like you were describing. And he talks about practice move as if you have a fiery iron ball in your mouth and you can't swallow it and you can't spit it out. And it's that intensity that you were describing that I really heard. I wanted to ask you. I've got a whole bunch of questions, and I don't want to dominate. Maybe I'll ask one, and then we'll open up and take some from some other folks, and then we can come back in. Uh, as I was reading your memoir, your narrative, um, the word difficult um, was came to me. It's not that you were saying it so much, but I was just really feeling how difficult this practice was. Was there a point that came uh, where it no longer felt that way?
Definitely. I think my natural negativity bias at the beginning made me focus on the parts that felt really difficult, but certainly there were a lot of moments that were very pleasurable and that weren't just struggle at the beginning. When I described, for example, first moving rocks as part of my, manual labor and chores and Zen training, it was actually really exhilarating. I loved the feeling of using my body. I had never sort of like had a reason or an excuse to use it that way. And it felt wonderful. And part of it was this feeling of just being in my body, being outside. It was almost like discovering I had done martial arts and had done, athletic activities in the past, but there was something about something as basic as just picking up this really heavy rock and moving it from one place to another with purpose that just felt like made me feel like I was sort of discovering my body in a way that I had never, used it before or discovered it before. Um, Sitting zazen, doing the martial arts, doing fine arts, a lot of aspects of that were just, they were thrilling. I really enjoyed it. I found them to be intellectually really stimulating. I found myself really curious. I wanted to understand how it worked. And then even the parts that were hard, for example, I think I mentioned my kendo teacher, Teshima Sensei, saying early on, very Japanese culturally, this way of thinking, that when you have a teacher, you're supposed to like watch them so closely, like you're trying to steal their secrets. And I think of like a bank heist movie, where the main characters like go in and they're casing the joint and they're like watching, oh, the teller comes in and eats her, at this time, puts her coffee down first and eats her lunch at this time and has this nervous tick. And, you're watching everything so carefully as if you want to steal it. And to approach working with a teacher, training with a teacher that way, oh, how does he get up? How does he walk? How does he respond to this question? How does he take the glass of water when it's handed to him? How does he, get up and try to clear the table and do the chores and then insist when the students tell him, no, 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 sensei, I'll do it, I'll do it, I'll do it. Um, all of those, those things, it was like, even to be told that I should pay attention to that level was so new to me that I took it as a really exciting challenge. And there were also, of course, moments where each of those activities that I just described felt really overwhelmingly difficult. But there was at the sort of overlapping or at the same time, this feeling of really enjoying the challenge of it. And then I think maybe more to what you might have been asking, Jeff, there were moments where my relationship to difficulty really changed, and it's best exemplified. And it didn't like flip overnight, and now I have no struggles whatsoever. It comes and it goes. But there was a moment where, for example, like physical pain is a really good example. It's just a very like neat analogy or example, where the physical pain of, say, sitting in zazen was no longer this thing that was so overwhelming and that had a lot of emotion and affect tied to it, or a lot of narrative. It was just this understanding that, like, yeah, discomfort is kind of like the price of entry. It's part of it. It's part of what's happening right now. And I mean, that's a pretty good analogy or metaphor for, suffering is just a part of being alive and being human. And so, I think that sort of acceptance, but not in like a passive or not acceptance in the sense of like resigning myself to, oh, life is suffering, or oh, exhaustion's always painful. But it was just a very matter of fact of like, yeah, this is part of being alive, is feeling my foot on fire.
Wonderful, wonderful. I like your reference to, and I recall in the book, that level of attention, watching your teacher literally doing everything, because it, it seems to me that that's where we learn that Zen practice is not something that we do in the Zendo and then it's over with and we go outside and then we do our normal life, but that it's continuous. It's continuous, and it's you know, and it's expressed through a master, um, you know, in a bowl of Cheerios, and how we take the Cheerios. I also like that you mentioned the rocks, because you know, throughout your book, you referred to moving big rocks a lot, and I thought either they're getting regular deliveries of new rocks all the time, or somebody is saying move them over there, and then changing their mind and saying, okay, I changed my mind, let's move them, let's move them back over there. So it seems like the rock moving is an endless practice at Shozenji.
Yes, I think it was very, it stood out as an experience for sure in my mind, which is maybe why it comes up a lot. But other people have definitely moved rocks a lot more than I have. We have a number of rock walls. And so I know people who, you know, their first task training at the dojo was to build that rock wall, and you know, it would take months, and you have rocks in a wheelbarrow, and we have like a place where they're stored in the back of the grounds, and then you put them in a wheelbarrow, you bring them up, you try to place them in the wall, and then you, at the end of the day, if they're left over, you take them back. So it wasn't necessarily a, you know, I'll move them over there, I changed my mind, move them over here now. It was just as the projects developed. So when I first got here, you know, we had this empty lot across the street where we had rocks. They were sort of strewn around the place. And then one of our priests started coming in to weed whack that lot, and the rocks would get in the way. So that was my first task, was to consolidate them in one place. That was why I was moving them. But at a later time, for just, you know, by way of example, we ended up developing that lot, and it's still in construction to create new housing. And so all the rocks had to be moved again, but for a purpose, you know, because now they were going to build on that property. So they had to go somewhere else. And then as different projects have come up, you sort them and sort of move them around.
So it was not capricious. I'm happy to hear that. Um, let's take a moment here, and Chloe, I might need your help. I can't see everybody, but if somebody has a question or a comment, and the best way I think is going to be to raise your electronic hand, which is down under React or Reactions, depending on uh, uh, the version that you have. And
Looks like Avery has her hand up.
thank you, Chloe. That helps a lot. Everyone, go ahead and unmute and.
Not sure if, hey friends, not sure if you can see me.
Yeah, we can.
So wonderful to see you. We've known each other a long time, and you know, I very much appreciated your sharing with us like the somatic spiritual feeling of training where you've gotten to train, because you're right, many Zen centers in the continental US and other parts of like Western Europe, they don't have that so much. You know, maybe they were started by a teacher who migrated from Asia but has since died, and now we're a couple of generations removed. And for me, I had to find many of the things that you needed as well. I had to find them in other places. You know, I had to do 7 years of competitive martial arts, or I had to do, you know, frontline protest work in mutual aid and other stuff where you kind of really brought the vibrancy and urgency of the practice to real life. So I wanted to thank you for that. And I guess just the last, I don't want to take too much time, but like, the last comment I had is like the moving the rocks thing. I got to go back to Tassajara, which is San Francisco Zen Center's monastery that was started by Suzuki Roshi many years ago. And I hadn't been there in like 10 years. And I spent 5 days, digging a ditch, trying to find a gigantic septic tank that they had lost somehow. They didn't have the plans. There hadn't been enough like institutional knowledge shared, whatever. And it was amazing to watch how I had changed just by continuing to show up for practice every day. Because I was like, yeah, I'm just digging the hole because it needs to be dug. Like it's just a thing to do now. And there's just such it is liberation to be able to turn oneself over to the needs of the moment rather than my preferences, my ideas, my fantasies, my likes, my dislikes, all of that stuff. It's just like, oh, this moment I'm reminded is the most important moment of my life right now. And how do I show up for it best with a sense of, like you said, sensitivity, harmony, and intuition, a sense of intuition and love. And it's just really wild that this stuff just happens if we just stick around and we commit ourselves as deeply as we can. So I really appreciate seeing you and hearing your story.
Speaking of how wild it is that these things happen if we just stick around, I'll just share, Avery and I met, was it 20 years ago now?
At least, yeah. At least.
Maybe 20 years ago doing human rights advocacy work around Burma. And we went to Avery came with me on a trip that I led to the Thai-Burma border, where we met with former political prisoners, visited refugee camp and clinics.
And we also, I forget her name. Do you remember her name? The woman that went to Sri Lanka to be ordained as a monk because it was illegal for her.
Yeah. We met one of the first bhikkhuni who became an ordained bhikkhuni in Sri Lanka. And I wanted to bring that up because I spent some time in my book writing about my human rights work. And it occurred to me just now as Avery was speaking, like that it might be useful to bring up for this crowd, which is a group of activists, people who are committed to social justice and social change in some way. And what Avery was talking about with that showing up for the moment, just doing what was needed. I think as an activist, I particularly struggled with that sometimes because my proclivities, my habits as an activist were to change a situation, but to show up and just do what's needed. And I have some examples too in my book of certain, sometimes slightly off-color jokes and teasing that my teacher, who's an older Japanese man, Japanese American man, certain jokes that he would make that I would just have to sort of be like, I know he's not being anti-feminist right now, but he's definitely poking at something very knowingly in me that is a sensitivity around this. And I had to look at my impulses as an activist and an advocate to want to say, to want to sort of like make an issue out of it when really the training opportunity was in just responding to and doing what was appropriate for the moment. And this came up somewhat recently for someone who is just running for state house in our district. And Hawaii has this tradition of sign waving. You got to go out on the street at rush hour and hold up a sign and be the candidate and just wave at cars going by. Nobody on the mainland does this anymore because they know that they can't measure its effectiveness. Like it makes no difference. But in Hawaii, it's really important. And all the aunties and the uncles and grandpa and grandma, they expect to see you out there. It is the sign that you're working hard and you're serious about your campaign. But this candidate was like, this is so annoying. Why do I have to do this? And it was actually through coming up to the dojo and participating in a tea ceremony. And that aspect of like, sometimes when you're at a tea ceremony and you're the guest, even if you disagree with certain things, you don't appreciate certain aspects of the ceremony, your job is to enjoy being there. Your job is to find the enjoyment. Like, that's your responsibility. So how do you just do that in the moment? And actually that inspired him to say, you know what? If I'm aspiring to be these people's representative in the state legislature, auntie and uncle, this is what they want. And my responsibility is to do this for them, to demonstrate to them in terms that make sense for them, that I'm working hard and I will work hard for them. And so that sense of just like, I think we can, in our modern world, want to change situations, do what's comfortable, change a situation so that we'll be more comfortable, when actually it's just, how do I really be sort of really put all of that aside, put my ego aside, and just do what needs to be done right now. I really appreciate you bringing that up, Avery. Thank you.
Thanks, Avery. I want to pronounce your name correctly. Belem? Belem, you have your hand up?
Thank you. Yes, I'm just so honored to meet you, Christina. I am about to finish your book. I'm listening to your recording of the book, so putting a face to what has been my constant companion as I drive around my area is just a privilege. I call myself a Zen Crawler. I only started to use your words, training, about a year ago at the Austin Zen Center, which is in the San Francisco Zen Center line. And one of the things that brought me to Zen practice was the desire to bring out the authentic self. And I think that there's so many aspects of your book, the katonk. I wonder what the Latino immigrant equivalent for that would be. But also your social justice work. I spent a lot of time working in the labor trafficking, human trafficking space, and then the realization that, as many people talk about, there are the bodies floating down the river, and at some point we should be working on what's putting the bodies in the river and not fishing those bodies out. So in this whole journey, one of the things I struggle with is, how as Zen practitioners, and you've covered some of this already, how are we in the world? How are we active, and how are we in the world? I think that's the best way to put it. And understand both our role and our authentic selves within it, as we deal with so much pain and suffering. There's a part of me that's like, you need to rescue all these people. It's your responsibility. And I struggle with that whole sense of working in this world.
Yeah. Thank you, Balam. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your kind words and for your question too. My teacher has a very pithy and again pokey way of putting it. He says, the last thing the world needs is another depressed activist. It's true. It's true. I watched in myself and in other people when I was in movement work. And that was predominantly what I was doing. I saw people get sort of bitter, jaded, vicariously traumatized or directly traumatized. And then that, it starts to corrupt the good intentions of the work, and then the realities of doing movement work and social change work also are sometimes that you can't be ideologically like a purist about what you're doing. Sometimes you have to work with people that you wouldn't otherwise be so happy to work with. You would have issues with them, like members of the military, folks that have problematic backgrounds. or connected to institutions that are very problematic and cause harm. But in that moment, they're trying to do something that creates a greater good. And so it's just like, you know, there's a lot of complexity. But to your question more of essentially like, maybe like taking on that burden, I don't really have a good answer sort of in words. It feels unsatisfactory when I think about how I would phrase it. But there's just an immediacy. Maybe it's related to the moving rocks. Maybe it's related to like the physical aspect of the training. I know the physical limits of my body. And I would say like nowhere have I learned this better than actually in boxing. I often think about how when I was younger and even not that long ago, from watching action movies or narratives of women's empowerment, I kind of thought that like, you know, if Maggie Q can figure out how to fight a guy on screen who's 2 times as big as her, like it must be possible. And maybe I could figure it out if I just learned the right fighting techniques. And in boxing, I just realized that there is like a real limit. My boxing coach, who's comes in, our boxing coach who comes in from Shanghai once a year. We have an instructor here, but she's the instructor's teacher. She's a woman about my size, and she's a 7-time world champion boxer. And she gets the question sometimes about like, okay, so, you know, since you're a world champion boxer, if you were like walking through a park at night and you got attacked by a man, like, how would you defend yourself? And her answer is really easy. Like, I wouldn't be walking through a park by myself at night, period. Like, you just don't put yourself in that situation in the first place. And part of that is knowing the limitations of your body. It goes both ways, of course, where the physical training, there are moments again and again and again where you feel so exhausted, or you feel so stretched thin that you're like, I can't do this. I can't punch the heavy bag for another 3-minute round. I can't spar with this person. I can't do another round of squats with this 20-pound kettlebell. But then you do it. And that starts to chip at your self-imposed limitations and your sense of what you can and cannot do. So it kind of goes in both directions to reach a more realistic sense of really what are the limits of your body. And there's some extension of that because it's intuitive. It's not with words. I can't write you a mathematical equation that tells you like what I'm capable of and what I'm not and where the limit is, but I know where it is. And in the same way, when I'm looking at social problems, I just have a sense of like, yeah, there's a limit. Like there's certain things that I can't do. I think, so that's maybe like the more practical side of how Zen training can help you let go of essentially what is an expression of the ego. You wanting to save all these people, me wanting to save all these people. And at the same time, the other sort of like Zen lesson or realization or influence that can be had on our work is also is maybe more on the transcending the self-imposed limitations side, which is, or I take that back. I think that it's still like understanding where that true limit is, seeing reality clearly. Because you can just give everything that you have. You can find the thing, there's a quote, you know, find the thing that you love and then just burn yourself out doing it. Like, you could do that if you wanted, but can you do that and still own a house and go to the movies and like have a life and have social, you know, have a social life? Maybe not. One of the best examples that I've had of that is actually a close friend who passed away last week. Her name was Twinkle Borge. She was Native Hawaiian houseless advocate. She didn't start out meaning to be a houseless advocate. She actually just was houseless. She was on the street for maybe like almost 20 years. And at some point, she found a really good spot by the boat harbor on the leeward side of Oahu, and was living there, and very out of sight, out of mind. It was a good spot. And there was a woman who showed up in her car with 3 small kids one day and said, "This looks like a really good spot. Would you mind if we stayed here too? We just lost everything. We need somewhere to sleep tonight." And Twinkle looked at them, and at first she was sort of like, "Oh man, like I had a good thing going here. These people want to stay here now. These kids are going to be loud." But then she said, "Yes, you can stay here." And she looked at them and realized that they didn't have anything. Whatever situation they had left really fast. So she looked at her tent and her cot and said, "They need these things more than I do." And so she literally gave them everything she had. She gave them her house, her bed, and said, "You need it, take them." And then she proceeded to do that over the next 13 years, over and over and over again. And there were a bunch of things that came out of this. She eventually had a village of like 300 people living at the boat harbor. It was an encampment. They were in tents. They couldn't build permanent structures. But it was incredibly ordered and it was safe. And the reason that I got connected with Twinkle was because a mutual acquaintance of ours had put out a survey at one point in the local public school, the elementary school, and asked like 50 different kids, "Who's one adult that you trust?" And like 50 of them had written down Twinkle's name. And she was like, so he was like, "Who is this lady? I gotta figure this out." And it turns out she's a houseless lady living at the boat harbor. Like, that was nuts. But Twinkle was such a great example of, she didn't have a lot of expectations of a normal life, of committing herself to her cause and saving all these people and still having some sense of normalcy in a normal life at the same time. She was ready to just completely be with her community and with her people. And she had the option. Her family actually, when she was sober, gave her the chance to move back in with them. And she chose to stay houseless so that she could be with her people, with the village that needed her. And so she's my example in a way of, she didn't train in Zen, but she had the same insight that would come from Zen training, which is that there are many moments where you know the limit, what you can and cannot do. And you know that it's a choice. And then I think there are other moments where you understand that the choice that is available to you is a really, truly radical one. And it's one that you can make if you really want to.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think the bringing up of the self and the ego and questioning, it's like, have now come to question sometimes, why am I doing this? Am I doing this because I want to feel better about myself, because I want others to notice me, because what is my self-motivation on this? And I think the other thing that permeates from your example from Twinkle is that being with one person and being compassionate in that one moment, rather than being absorbed by all the others that you cannot get to, but being very, very present in that moment and being present with that person can probably move more mountains than just wanting to move a mountain, but not, not having enough strength to do that, right? We moved the little pebbles one by one. So
yeah, or I want to save so many people, I'm gonna touch the surface of a lot of different people rather than, well, there's one person in front of me and I could go all the way. Yeah, thank you. I like that way of putting it.
Francisco, you've got your hand up, and are you coming in from Argentina?
Hi everyone, how are you? Yeah, actually, I'm from Córdoba, Argentina.
Welcome.
Nice meeting you all. Cristina, it's an honor. It's an honor to meet you. As far as I understand, your book has a political side also. I wonder about it because I always question myself and think which could be a contribution of Zen Buddhism to the current global political crisis and state of politics today. I agree with you. It's a state of division with crisis over crisis. So I always think that maybe Buddhism in general, particularly Zen Buddhism, something to it.
Thank you, Francisco. Yeah, I think the greatest contribution, if we could definitely have more enlightened leadership in this world. And I think one of the keys to that would just be a greater ability to see clearly, see reality as it is, without the overlays of our biases, our habits, and our narratives. I think that would be the most profound thing. If people could truly just see reality as it is. If you do look at our, a lot of our problems, whether it's global hunger or disease or political division and war, I mean, these are all man-made problems. These are problems also that we have technical solutions for. Like, we have enough food in the world to feed everyone. We have enough money and capital in the world to provide education and healthcare to the people who are alive right now. What we don't have is the enlightened leadership or the political will to do it. So, that I think is where Zen training or any kind of spiritual forging and training could really benefit people in humanity.
Agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. Lovely to have you here too, by the way. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you all.
Cristina, I want to go in kind of a bit different direction. 800 years ago, Ehe Dogen reminded us that what we're really doing in Zen practice is studying ourselves. And I can't remember the word that you used, but at one point when you were talking about yourself, and I don't want to use the wrong word, but I probably will. But it was something like describing yourself. It was something like contrary or stubborn or resistant or something like that. And it occurs to me that as physical as your practice is, perhaps I don't want to assume this, but perhaps the real difficulty, the real work, might have been internally, might have been, studying the self of Cristina. Can you say a little bit about that and maybe correct whatever word that it was that you used? You didn't use it very often.
In local parlance, we just say hard head. It means stubborn. I'm really lucky, frankly. I don't have many physical limitations at all. I have a pretty strong, constitution. I mean, I'm physically in good shape. So the physical training has never, it's been hard, but it's not hard for me in the way that it is for other people who have had, injuries or disease or who are older. So definitely, I count myself very lucky in that regard. But what the physical training has done for me, most of all, I think, is actually through the exhaustion and having to just push through. So in the way that you described doing the long distance cycling and trail running, I've had to sort of come to terms with the amount of times and the frequency with which I used to feel like I was leaving something on the table, like I wasn't actually giving it everything I had. I don't write about this a ton in my book. It's maybe a realization that's come since the book, since that point in time, that like where the book ends, and then after writing it, as well as I was sharing with Jeff, a lot of the book I described training in Kendo, the way of the sword, and Chado, the way of tea. And I actually, at the beginning of this year, told my teachers I wanted to pause on both of those. There were two other arts I had also been training in that I had chosen for myself. One was boxing, one was ceramics, and I really wanted to focus on those and try to go deep. And the boxing has been really eye-opening, because once I started sparring, I realized that even if my goal in the instruction was to actually make contact and hit the other person, there was something that was holding me back. So I couldn't connect, even if it's just very light, a light, body shot to the shoulder, to the, the side or something. I was always like 1 or 2 inches short, and my arm wasn't fully extended. And so there was something that was like keeping me from connecting and going all the way. And in the same way, I realized that in other aspects of my life, there was this feeling like, oh, I didn't give it everything I had. I could have done a little bit more. And that is tied to that sense of being physically very able and adept. Like I had never pushed myself, to the point where I was going to throw up or something like that. I always had a little bit left in the tank. And so the physical training has been really valuable for me, because at the same time, or in the same way that I've started to understand, unravel, and sort of undo that habit to always hold back that last inch or two to not connect, I've found that as I connect more in my boxing, I change that physical habit, it's getting resolved in other places in my life as well, where I feel like, oh, I could have tried a little harder on that campaign. Oh, I could have pushed a little harder to find resolution in this conflict. That was something where, those are things that I'm finding I feel less and less of that remorse and regret later on. But absolutely, the physical part is challenging, but the real work is much more complex.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Frank Martinez, I see you have your hand. Go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, hi, Cristina. Glad to be here, and thank you for your talk. And my experience as a Zen practitioner, as well as a aspiring musician, studying musician, is this idea of making progress, if you will, and then reaching plateaus where it just seems like no matter what you do, you don't make any progress. And then if you keep pushing through, eventually something opens up. So I'm just curious about your own experience with that, and what you think that process tells us about bringing that out into the world as well.
Yeah, those are the doldrums, right? Where it just feels like, oh, I was doing so great, and what happened? Nothing's happening, nothing's moving. And that's the most dangerous point, because that's when people can quit. They sort of feel like, oh, well, I guess I reached my peak. I guess that's as good as it's gonna get, and I won't be satisfied. So that's often when people will be like, well, I guess I'll try something else now, rather than keeping on going. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's the perseverance and patience, sort of knowing that, like, it'll change at some point. But it's also, I've found for me, you got to change things up sometimes. And so then it might be, and oftentimes just adding some intensity. So this is the part that I just have loved about Zen training. I write about in my book how one of the first things that I did when I got here after my first 3 weeks is we did an all-night training. And moments like that of just push what feels possible. And especially when I could do it with a group of people. Yeah, that really supercharges my training, and those moments when I feel like, I mean, it's inevitable that when you're in a group and you're all doing something really hard together and challenging yourselves, and and supporting and egging each other on. Something's going to give, something's going to break, and then you can have a breakthrough. And then it's inspiring too, even if it's not your own breakthrough, to see it in other people, and that feeling alone kind of gets you to move forward. So I'll give you an example, a couple examples. So we do session, which you guys would be familiar with if you train in Zen. It's the 1 week long intensive training. In our tradition, we sit for anywhere between like 6 to 8 hours a day. It's very formal. There's a lot of rules. You get scolded a lot. There's very specific ways to eat, and you don't sleep very much. And so you just get exhausted. And when people are going through it together, definitely it's running through their head, like, I don't know if I can do this. And then you find a way individually and together with the group of you all get through it. We also did, the week before last, we did a boxing session. So we got up at 5, we meditated, we did Sanzen Koan training, and then we did strength and conditioning and some technique in the morning for about 3 hours. One day we ran like 6K, and then there was some recovery, and then work outside. And then in the evening we had more zazen and teisho and another boxing class. So it was altogether 5 hours of boxing a day. And that was very different. It was less sort of psychologically grueling than sesshin usually is, but it was physically really tough. But the feeling afterward of like, 5 hours of boxing a day, even if I've been doing it like 5 or 6 days a week, an hour and a half. That was a huge change and a shift change in my ability and my learning, but also to do it with a group like that was amazing. Another example of just like how you manufacture moments like that to change things up is one of our members here is the pianist with the Hawaiʻi Symphony Orchestra. And a long time ago, she got really interested in the piano sonatas of Joseph Haydn, and he wrote 57 complete sonatas, 62 including the fragments. And nobody, to her knowledge, had ever performed all of them. Maybe at most what we found is that someone has performed them over the course of 4 or 5 days. And she said, why not do it all at once? And so, this is her Zen training. She's going to take like 12 to 14 hours with bathroom breaks and food breaks, but she's going to do like 12 to 14 hours of playing all 62 of Joseph Haydn's sonatas on the piano in one day. And her goal is like, maybe I'll hear music differently. Maybe I'll experience it differently afterwards. I don't know what's going to happen to me, but it's a crazy idea and I'm just going to do it. So, there are definitely ways to create these challenges and break through those plateau moments. But oftentimes they seem irrational and a bit insane. So we don't usually think of that.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Frank. Much appreciated. Friends, we have just a few more minutes. If someone else has another question here, we can take that. Otherwise, I do. But I want to share. What I wanted to ask you about, activism was so much a part of your life before your Buddhist practice or kind of moving into that. Is that still something that's active for you? If you could say a bit about that.
Yes, it's definitely evolving for me. So I don't write about it. But prior to coming to Chozenji, prior to coming to Hawaii, I actually went to business school. That part of the reasoning for that was understanding that there were innovation and technology in particular were a new avenue, a different avenue to pursue social change and to improving the condition of the world. And I thought at the time that like maybe meditation and tech were the intersection I was looking for. I joke that I was looking for like a meditation startup, when I was coming out of business school, and I found it. It was just in a monastery in the back of a valley in Hawaii, not where I expected. So, I've been very focused here for the past 6 or 7 years, and actually now the climate tech space has really exploded in a really positive way, and I'm pursuing opportunities there. It's a really great way for me of great continuation of my life of being mission driven and doing mission driven work. But I'm very interested in that world of a particular kind of leadership that you find in the tech sector and in very innovative communities. So that personally is the area, or professionally the area that I'm leaning into. But my activism, I find it in a lot of different places. So that's been in being involved in Twinkle's Village, and now that she's passed, finding new ways to maybe renew my commitment and my involvement there, whether it's supporting, I still have friends who are doing work in Burma, or supporting friends in their activism wherever it may find them, or if they're running for office. It continues to be a really big part of my life. And frankly, I see the Zen training, because Shozenji is not a place where people are supposed to come and be monks and then like live as hermits for the rest of their lives. The purpose of this place is actually to train leaders who are going to go into the world and who are going to make a difference. And so running programs here, training myself deeply, training with others, that to me feels like an extension of a part of my activism that continues to this day.